Hey, welcome back, brothers and sisters. We're continuing on with our North Pole, our Mercator series. If you've been following me, we've been diving deep on this Mercator map, the land of the Pygmies, Dogon cosmology, and just really diving deep into our true human origins. Well, we're just gonna continue the series today because we got so much more to go over. In the previous video, we spent 6 hours explaining the evolution of Mercator's maps, and we pretty much went over the basic Mercator map, the 1569 world map. That'll be the one you see in the bottom right corner. We pretty much got familiar with those 4 lands. We also went over the double quarter-form world map, and we dove deep in that last video, and we went for 6 hours. And we also talked about the nature of the darkness that Mercator showed in his map in the form of a dark tower. We expressed the nature of that dark tower. Well, in this series, we're just gonna move forward with some more information on Mercator and his map, and also what he described this North Polar region to be like. I truly believe that the map we're looking at in the bottom right corner is what the North Pole looked like. I trust Mercator because his map goes along with all of the ancient cosmology and ancient accounts of the North Pole, as you see in the collage, and we already went over that. So Mercator talks a lot about these 4 continents and what life is like in this part of the earth. And I would like to share some of Mercator's writings and some information about the North Pole so that we can get a peek into this region. So we previously read that Mercator died in 1594, leaving his last great project, a 6-volume atlas in history of the world, unfinished. His only surviving son, Rumhold, and the men of his workshop, which included 3 of his grandsons, gathered up his completed materials and published them as a 3rd volume to accompany the 2 already published. These materials included 28 maps and the first chapter of his history. One of those maps was an enlargement and update of his North Polar projection. As with the 1569 map, the most distinctive feature of the map is 4 large islands where the Arctic Ocean should be. In the text on the map, Mercator explains that the waters of the oceans rush inward between the islands to the pole, where they plunge deep into the earth. At the pole is a black island 33 leagues in circumference. A magnetic island lies just north of the Bering Straits. On one of the large islands is the legend Pygmy Inhabitant. So you can see in the bottom right corner of this map, the land of the Pygmy. It says Pygmy Habitat. This is the land where the Pygmies say that they originate from. You will have to argue with the Pygmy, not Brother Sanchez. Also to the right is a collage showing you ancient symbols all around the world that symbolize this dark tower that Mercator spoke of. As strange as these islands look, they were not products of Mercator's imagination. He had a source. Mercator read the story in a now lost 14th century book, the Itinerarium of Jacobus Noyen. Noyen had 2 sources. He learned the main part of the story from an unnamed traveler who heard it from another unnamed traveler. The earlier unnamed traveler is supposed to have written the story in another now lost book, Inventio Fortunata. Noyen's other source was the Gestae Arthuri. Mercator gave a brief explanation of these sources in a text box on a 1569 world map. Meanwhile, in England, Dr. John Dee was looking for ways to expand the British Empire over the entire Arctic. It was a bit of a hard sell. In 1553, a chartered company had sent 3 ships to open up a northeast passage around Russia and Siberia to the Indies. The captains and crews of 2 of the ships died in the cold and dark, while the 3rd made to a Russian port and brought back a trade agreement from the court of Ivan the Terrible. The Russian trade was profitable enough that very few in places of influence were willing to finance additional expeditions to die in the cold and dark on mere speculation. This wasn't enough to stop Dee, who argued that British merchants should turn their attention to the Northwest. Dee argued that not only was there a Northwest Passage waiting to be discovered, but that the British were entitled to own the passage and the lands around it through the right of prior discovery and occupation by expeditions in the time of King Arthur. In 1577, Dee wrote to Mercator asking for more information about Noyen's account. Mercator copied an extensive part of Noyen's book and sent it to Dee. Unfortunately, that letter has since been lost. Fortunately, Dee copied the letter into one of his secret notebooks. Unfortunately, the notebook was damaged when an angry mob, believing Dee to be an evil enchanter, set fire to his house. I'm not making this up. Most of what we know about Noyen's itinerarium and the anonymous Inventio Fortunata come from Dee's damaged notebook. Noyen explained that in the far north there is a mountain range that completely surrounds the North Pole at about 78 degrees. The mountains are penetrated by 19 ocean channels with currents so strong that any ship entering the channels will be dragged north with no hope of escape. The 19 channels combine to form 4 indrawing seas. One of the lands between the seas is fairly nice. 2 are completely uninhabited, and 1 has pygmies. The province of Dusky Norway is attached to one of the Arctic islands by a narrow isthmus. West of Dusky Norway is the easternmost extension of Asia, the charmingly named Province of Darkness. Above these 2 provinces is a large island called Grokland, which shields them from the indrawing seas. Some giants live on Grokland. The weather is misty and dull in the far north. There are no trees and the wind is too weak to turn a cornmeal, let alone prevent ships from being pulled to their doom. Naturally, King Arthur thought this gloomy barren land where the river sucked was just what he needed to add to his realm. In 530, he sent out armies and colonists and conquered the whole thing. This much comes from the lost Gestae Arturi. In 1364, 8 people came to the court of the King of Norway from the islands. They were descendants of some settlers who had been sucked into the indrawing seas. One of the 8 was a priest carrying an astrolabe that he said he had received from an English Mennonite monk whom he had met in the islands. This monk, he said, has spent years traveling the islands and making geographic observations with his astrolabe. The monk's description of the north confirmed that in the Gestae Arturi and added details about the arrangement of the channels and islands. He had journeyed as close to the pole as possible. At the top of the world, the 4 indrawing seas come together and circle round before disappearing into the earth beneath a black magnetic island. The only people the monk met in his travels were a band of pygmies, mostly women. The monk later wrote up his observations as a report of King Edward III of England. This is the Inventio Fortunata. And we'll be reading a little bit about this Inventio Fortunata, which is really like a traveler's guide of the North Pole. It's really an ancient tour guide, very interesting. I also find it interesting that the only people the monk met in his travels were a band of pygmies, and most of them was women. Scientists teach us that the human race originate from 5-foot women who were monkey-like creatures. They got the Lucy skeletons. Lucy would have been a pygmies. So we read on, it says that the priest from whom Noyen presumably heard the monk's story never laid eyes on the Inventio Fortunata. Mercator doesn't make clear whether he heard the story from the priest or from additional middlemen. However, Noyen must have had independent knowledge of the report. If the priest met the English monk on his way back from the north, he wouldn't have written the report yet. And Noyen mentions that the monk made 5 more voyages for Edward after writing the Inventio Fortunata. We too have independent confirmation that the report existed. Both Martin Beheim's 1492 globe and Johannes Rush 1507 world map mention using information from it. Be advised, people, that in some of the maps that was going around during this time, for example, in Johannes Rush's 1507 world map, there was a lot of things being altered. People were starting to destroy Mercator's great work. So again, for example, Johannes Rush's 1507 world map, Rush interpreted the 19 channels and 4 lands differently than Mercator. He also ignored the Pygmies and populated 2 of the islands with legendary tribes out of Herodotus. So here comes the beginning of the fairy tales surrounding the North Pole. This shows you an example of how we lost the facts. Mercator was on point and he was doing real investigation, and these 4 islands around the North Pole and the Dark Tower at the center of it that was spoken of by all the ancients and all of these symbols and all of these maps started to become occult knowledge. And when you talk about the North Pole today, you talk about Santa Claus. That's the popular story about the North Pole in our time. But during 1507, we see the beginning of the first North Pole mythologies to hide the truth. And in this map from Johannes Rush, he just completely ignored the land of the Pygmies and populated 2 of the islands with legendary tribes out of Herodotus. So right there, we start to blend Greek mythology with ancient truth, geographic truth. So now when we talk about the North Pole today, there are so many mythological stories across the world, but they all originated from the truth. And all of these symbols tell us the truth as well as Mercator. So it's time that we go back to the truth and snap out of the mythology, because our compasses are pointing us north for a reason. There's no myth about it, people. Mercator and the ancients were right about the nature of the North Pole. So let's read some more. The popular impression that map makers of the time simply made things up to fill empty space on their maps is not true. The best map makers combed through all the sources at their disposal, hunting for nuggets of information. Even the sea monsters were based on mariners' reports. And on Mercator's 1595 map, he based the far north on Noyen's book. The north coast of European Russia, he based on reports from the English merchants allowed in under the agreement with Ivan the Terrible. For Asia, he used Marco Polo and Pliny the Elder. Around Greenland, he included information from Martin Frobisher's 3 voyages, one of the projects that Dee had been lobbying for when he wrote to Mercator. The large, non-existent island of Friesland below Iceland and in the upper left-hand inset was based on a widely believed book about the voyages of a Venetian family in the 1380s. The real crime of Renaissance map makers was that they were so eager for information they ended up being credulous and uncritical. In the next century, additional information allowed cartographers the luxury of choosing between competing sources. So in the postscript of this article, it reads, "And what of the Arctic Pygmies? Pygmies in ancient and medieval lore were not merely small people. They were one of the monstrous races said to inhabit the far parts of the world. In the case of the Pygmies, monstrous was not a moral judgment. Pygmies were said to be brave and organized in their age-old war with the cranes. On his map, Mercator said that the Pygmies of the far north were like the Skraelings of Greenland. Skraeling is the word the Norse used for the various natives of the New World. Mainland Indians, the Dorset people of the islands, and the Eskimos who replaced the Dorsets in the early 2nd millennium. Kristen Seaver writes that although its exact etymology is obscure, the word Skraeling was almost certainly intended as a translation of pygmy. The Norse believed that Greenland and the lands to the west were either part of Asia or islands near Asia. The geography of the time had pushed the Pygmies far into Asia. When the Norse met small people in what they believed to be Asia, it made sense for them to believe they had discovered the homeland of the legendary Pygmies. Olaus Magnus described the pygmies of Greenland as small in stature but big of heart and able to kick butt many times their size. John Dee and Richard Hakluyt were certain that the traveling monk was Nicholas of Lynn. There are records of a Nicholas of Lynn who was a mathematician active in the second half of the 14th century. At first glance, a mathematician would be a good match for a man who traveled the world making measurements with an astrolabe. What little is known of the biography of this Nicholas excludes him. He was probably too young. He was a Carmelite brother, not a Mennonite, and there is no mention of him ever traveling, let alone spending years away on various missions for the king. But there is another possibility. In Lynn at that time, there was also a Mennonite house. Is it possible that there were two Nicholas of Lynn? If there was a Mennonite Nicholas of Lynn, what became of him? Noyen writes that monk went on 5 more missions for King Edward III, though he doesn't say what or where those missions were. Perhaps Nicholas engaged in regular mission work among the little people he found near the pole. Perhaps he eventually stayed with them and taught them reindeer herding and toy making. So it all makes sense now when we talk about Santa Claus or Saint Nicholas being at the North Pole with the little dwarfs, his little elves. So we see where they get this mythology from. It's based on real journals of expeditioners at that time. The Inventio Fortunata, or fortune-making discovery, is a lost book probably dating from the 14th century, containing a description of the North Pole as a magnetic island, the Rupes Nigra, surrounded by a giant whirlpool in 4 continents. No direct extracts from the document have been discovered, but its influence on a Western idea of the geography of the Arctic region persisted for several centuries. The book is said to be a travelogue written by a 14th century Franciscan Mennonite friar from Oxford who traveled the North Atlantic region in the early 1360s, making some half a dozen journeys conducting business on behalf of the King of England, Edward III. He described what he found on his first journey to the islands beyond 54 degrees north in a book, Inventio Fortunata, which he presented to the king. Unfortunately, by the time the Atlantic explorers were seeking information in the 1490s, the Inventio had gone missing and was only known through a summary in a second text, the Itinerarium, written by a Brabantian traveler from Hertogenbosch named Jacobus Noyen, also known as James Noyen. Noyen's summary was the basis for the depiction of the Arctic region on many maps, one of the earliest being Martin Beham's 1492 globe. By the late 16th century, even Noyen's text was missing, so most of what we know of the contents of the Inventio Fortunata, other than its use on the maps, is found in a letter from the Flemish cartographer Gerardus Mercator to the English astronomer John Dee, dated April 20, 1577, now located in the British Museum. Noyen's information came in a very roundabout way. In 1364, a priest from one of the Atlantic islands had returned to Norway, bringing with him an astrolabe, which he had received from the visiting Franciscan friar in exchange for a religious book. He made a detailed report to the King of Norway. Copies still survive of a social and geographical description of Greenland by a local church official named Ivar Bardason, who turns up in Norwegian records in 1364. So this much of Noyen's story tallies well with reality. Noyen seems to have obtained his information from Norwegian sources sometime later. Neither he nor the priest having actually seen the Inventio. Noyen's account, originally in his own language, mixes probable fact with what may have been his own attempts to research the background, stating that Greenland was the first settled at the orders of King Arthur, whose army supposedly conquered the North Atlantic islands. He also refers to the quote-unquote indrawing seas, currents which drew ships northward so that nearly 4,000 persons entered the indrawing seas who never returned. But in AD 1364, 8 of these people came to the king's court in Norway. Among them were 2 priests, one of whom had an astrolabe, who was descended in the 5th generation from a Brussels citizen. I say, all 8 were from those who had penetrated the northern groups in the first ships. Of the visiting Franciscan, Noyen or Mercator summarized the priest's report thus: leaving the rest of the party who had come to the islands, he journeyed further through the whole of the north and put into writing all the wonders of those lands, and gave the King of England this book, which he called in Latin Inventio Fortunata. In reality, the book may have been a detailed report intended mainly to highlight the commercial possibilities offered by the North Atlantic following the decline of Norwegian interest in its colonies. I think one interesting thing about the passage that we just read is the fact that it was said that nearly 4,000 people entered those indrawing seas at the middle of the earth, and a few of those people actually returned. So are we reading that this is like some sort of time travel portal at the North Pole? That's very interesting. So one thing I wanted to point out is today, most of this knowledge was hidden from our generation. This is ancient knowledge. This is normal stuff in the jungle. But today we laugh at it because we've been dumbed down to alienate us from this knowledge. Like I said, they turned it all into stupid mythologies like Santa Claus and elves and all of that. But where they get the whole St. Nicholas concept from is a guy by the name of Nicholas of Lynn. So this guy, Nicholas of Lynn, became known to us Westerners as St. Nicholas. And you know, this Nicholas of Lynn also got a lot of knowledge about the North Pole from the Pygmy people. So instead of them telling us about this stuff and being real with us about Nicholas of Lynn and the secrets of the North Pole and the Pygmy, they taught us that Santa Claus lived at the North Pole with elves. This is subconscious programming. They also deleted it from our maps. But I'll leave it up for you guys to decide. Compasses are obviously pointing us to something special at the North Pole. Mercator's contemporary, the 16th century English historian Richard Hakluyt, identifies the author of the Inventio as Nicholas of Lynn. Hakluyt apparently arrived at this conclusion because of Geoffrey Chaucer's mention of Nicholas in his treatise on the astrolabe. Hakluyt did not himself, of course, have a copy of the Inventio. Nicholas was alive at the right time and had the right skills, but he was a Carmelite friar, not a Franciscan, and no earlier biographer indicates that he spent years traveling back and forth across the Atlantic on government business. The concept of the pole as a magnetic mountain goes back at least to Roman times, but the author of the Inventio Fortunata added other features to the picture as well as measurements. Whether or not the Inventio is the source of the medieval concept of the North Pole as a magnetic mountain surrounded by a circular continent divided by 4 powerful rivers, maps as early as Martin Beham's 1492 globe depict the region in this way. Johann Rusch's Universaler Cogniti Orbis Tabula from 1508 features a marginal note mentioning the Inventio Fortunata. It is said in the book concerning the fortunate discovery that at the Arctic Pole there is a high magnetic rock, 33 German miles in circumference. I want to stop right there and point something out. Masons call themselves traveling men. Your first map makers and guys who hid all of this knowledge from us, of course, were Masons. They put all of this great ancient knowledge into the occult or mystery schools, and then they started dumbing us down. But don't y'all find it very strange that John Rush said these words? He said that in the book concerning the fortunate discovery, which is the Inventio Fortunata, that at the Arctic Pole there is a high magnetic rock, 33 German miles in circumference. We see this special number 33 that Masons use so often. Your 33rd degree Masons are also called arch degrees, and the Arch of the Covenant is this missing capstone. It also can be synonymous with the firmament dome and the goddess Nut Polaris. But we see that it's 33 German miles in circumference, and 33 is a very important number to Freemasons. It also says that a surging sea surrounds this rock as if the water were discharged downward from a vase through an opening. Around it are islands, 2 of which are inhabited. Harada's Mercator's world map of 1569 reflects his reading of Noyen's itinerarium. It also features a marginal note alluding to the Franciscans' discovery, but not to the book itself, which he never saw. We have taken from the itinerarium of Jacobus Noyen of the Hague, who makes some citations from the Gesta of Arthur of Britain. However, the greater and most important part he learned from a certain priest at the court of the King of Norway in 1364. He was descended in the 5th generation from those whom Arthur had sent to inhabit these lands, and he related that in the year 1360, a certain Minorite, an Englishman from Oxford, a mathematician, went to those islands, and leaving them, advanced still farther by magic arts and mapped out all and measured them by an astrolabe in practically the subjoined figure, as we have learned from Jacobus. The 4 canals there pictured, he said, flow with such current to the inner whirlpool that if vessels once enter, they cannot be driven back by wind. The Arctic map inset on Mercator's 1569 world map was the prototype for the influential and widely circulated Septentrionalium Terrarium of 1595, posthumously published by his son, and the maps in Ortelius Theatrum Orbis Terrarium of 1570. Both show the same configuration of the Arctic regions as the 1569 map. In his latter to D, Mercator further quotes Noyen's description of the northern regions. In the midst of the 4 countries is a whirlpool into which there empty these 4 indrawing seas which divide the north. And the water rushes round and descends into the earth just as if one were pouring it through a filter funnel. It is 4 degrees wide on every side of the pole, that is to say, 8 degrees altogether, except that right under the pole there lies a bare rock in the midst of the sea. Its circumference is almost 33 French miles. We see that number 33 again, and you can see these 4 continents around an all-seeing eye in this Masonic cosmos. And those 4 columns represent the 4 lands, and the eye in the middle represent Rupes Nigra, or the Dark Tower. So Masons know this secret, guys. Let's keep on reading. Its circumference is almost 33 French miles, and it is all of magnetic stone, and is as high as the clouds. So the priest said, who had received the astrolabe from this Minorite in exchange for a testament. And the Minorite himself had heard that one can see all around it from the sea, and that it is black and glistening, and nothing grows thereon, but there is not so much as a handful of soil on it. The persistence of this idea of the geography of the far north persisted throughout the 16th and 17th century. This is probably due to the influence of Rush, Mercator, and Ortelius. More interesting to modern researchers are the people the friar encountered, pygmies, who may well be identical with the Skrælings referred to in Old Norse texts about Greenland, predecessors of the modern Inuit. In 1956, a letter referring to the existence of the book was found in the Archivo General de Simancas from the English merchant John Day to the Admiral Christopher Columbus.